Welcome to episode 12 of The Coin Pod, a weekly podcast of conversations with whip-smart people all around the world who build, study, and use Bitcoin. I'm your host, Zach Volk. Critics of cryptocurrency wonks and even members of competing sects within the cryptocurrency space are somewhat routinely criticized for being cultish and tribalistic in their discourse and general behavior. Here to break down the good, bad, and sometimes ugly nature of tribalism specific to cryptocurrencies, that is my special guest, Chris DeRose. As with any guests on my show, you're more than likely not to agree with 100% of what Chris says, but you should nonetheless listen to and entertain his well-reasoned opinions for the duration of this episode. Besides, where's the fun in listening to or talking with someone you agree with all the time? Chris and I also chat about annoying and persistent virtue signals within the cryptocurrency and so-called blockchain space. Basically, this episode is jam-packed with lots of stuff you won't want to miss, so without further delay, here's Chris. Chris, thanks so much for coming on the show today. Really looking forward to talking with you. This should be a blast. Pleasure having you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
So, as I understand it, you've been around Bitcoin since the white paper was released, more or less. But you've since forsaken the faith and are bullish on Ethereum, according to some things you've written. And you write and tweet profusely about why you're bullish on Ethereum. But can you give me sort of the Cliff Notes version on why you're a Bitcoin blasphemer instead of a believer now?
Oh, sure. Just to make it clear, though, I can't represent that I've been here since the actual white paper days. I can prove that I was here in 2011. So that's what I tell people, though I've been in here for a good while. So I just make it nice and easy. Everybody wants to claim seniority in this space, and nobody has proof of it in any case. Yeah, so, it depends, I got a few identities. Which identity do you want for your show? Do we want the most public-facing identity, or do we want a degree of asymmetric identity in the sense that I give you more higher functioning thoughts on my opinions of Ethereum?
A degree of asymmetric identity would be perfectly fine. I'm looking more for the punchy, provocative, but simultaneously thoughtful, mindful Chris. So whichever Chris you want is the Chris I want to talk to.
Yeah, I don't always know the demographics. It helps to understand that. So, here's the thing about Ethereum right now. To date, there's really been nobody to find a use for smart contracts whatsoever. There are people who hear that statement and they go just ballistic. It's like you called their mother a bad name or something. And I get it, because a lot of people's identities, like their personal struggles, are tied to these investment products, which is probably a good thing for investors, quite clearly. But in my estimation, that's the glaring issue with Ethereum. Now, that being said, I've reluctantly come to the conclusion that it probably doesn't matter in many ways what the hell a blockchain does, because seemingly the most important feature of a blockchain is its liquidity. So, whether or not smart contracts makes sense from an economic standpoint, it may very well be that the virtue of this advertisement is enough to generate liquidity on this market. And in fact, that's what Ethereum has definitely succeeded in. So regardless of whether or not people need smart contracts, regardless of a lot of perhaps traditional indicators of efficiency, it nonetheless has this virtue amongst the hodlers, wherein it comports with certain values. These hodlers attach their personal sense of struggle and purpose to this product. And so I get that now. And in many ways, Bitcoin showed up and provided that function for a group of very conservative online programming technical types. And in having done that, it alienated a group to the opposite side of the spectrum, which seems to be generally, not always, a fairly liberal, progressive bunch that is in the Ethereum camp. So I think if you're with me thus far, if you believe those extraordinary statements are true, as I do, then number one, that has to mean that Ethereum has at least some value to these people. Number two, and this is where it gets interesting, maybe censorship resistance isn't important for a swath of the space. While it has been the reason that a lot of people arrived into Bitcoin, certainly, and it's the reason why the efficiencies have existed in blockchain, seemingly. Nonetheless, it doesn't necessarily map to liquidity. So if we live in a world where these products are going to be allowed to be invested in, where people are going to be able to attach their identities to these values, then I guess Ethereum serves a function, number one. And number two, what I really like to do is kind of stir the pot with that community a little bit. Now, before you judge me for just wanting to do that, we have to ask ourselves what our obligations are in the space as people who do attach identities to these products. Because what is certain is if you attach your identity to Ethereum, to the degree that you attach your identity to Ethereum is the degree to which you will be communicating social distance from other products. As such, your existence has to be antithetical to some other existence. And so I think if we're this far along, then we can decide, are we Bitcoiners? Are we cryptocurrency people? Are we Ethereumers? And based on that, if we are not Ethereumers, we have an obligation to join the Ethereum community and steer it in a direction that we think will be advantageous for us in the identity that we've chosen. Now, I get that that's some high-level thinking. I don't know to what degree your audience will appreciate this type of stuff, so I can tone it down completely, or I can keep it up with the high-level talk. You tell me.
No, it's fine. I think for anyone who may have difficulty sort of comprehending or apprehending the thoughts that Chris just shared, you should definitely start off by following him on Twitter, because he breaks it down in more bite-sized chunks in some of his tweets, and you'll also see links to his website with blog posts that break it down even more for you. And I think something you said, that to the extent to which someone attaches their identity to a given project is in proportion to the amount that they are distanced from or seen as toxic to other projects and that sort of thing. And I think specifically to Bitcoiners and Ethereiumites, there's some of that animosity is, in my opinion, misplaced in the sense that Bitcoin and Ethereum compete in rather different realms. And the best explanation I've seen for this idea is something Andreas explained in one of his old videos about how Ethereum and Bitcoin are like a lion and a shark. They're both dominant in their respective domains, but they never necessarily go head to head. And Bitcoin is, or Ethereum is one big distributed supercomputer, while Bitcoin, according to the current narrative, is digital gold. And yet the two teams, at least on Bitcoin's end, has a lot of animosity for the other project, seeing them as toxic or a cult or censored and all of that sort of stuff. Do you see, or do you agree with the idea that they don't really compete head to head, and some of this animosity is just manufactured and maybe unnecessary?
So, as time goes on, like I'm trying to advocate that people don't disclose their position. I see this in Bitcoin. It comes from a really good place where we have this belief that if we just tell everybody how we feel, that everyone will come to the same page. But the universe doesn't work like that for a lot of reasons. So like, I think that there's an incentive for people to always promote a non-competitive agenda. I think we should always espouse the view that we want to work together. But at the end of the day, the truth is that no, we don't always want to work together. We should probably strive, for the sake of like just being decent, we should strive to always want to work together, and we should compromise. And the degree to which we compromise is the degree to which we will have the power to ultimately pick and choose who goes. And no one person has the ability to make Ethereum go at this moment. But in that sort of context, I think that people need to like consider where the words are coming from and what those people's incentives are. They shouldn't be shamed for espousing beliefs that may be untrue. But as like individuals, we should consider, I think, what is he really trying to say? What are his actions? And create an impression from there. So these blockchains do compete in a zero-sum game in the sense that generally attention power, energy power are limited. The types of people who get into the space are probably going to either mine one at the exclusion of others, or even like some subset at the exclusion of others. I think two, if this is in fact a liquidity game, then it's conceivable that the liquidity Ethereum and vice versa. Though I will say there are some nuances there. With these things kind of work both ways. As you get older, you kind of realize that both sides are right. And like what I kind of missed, I think in 2016 a little bit, was like these weird esoteric cases wherein the brand of Bitcoin got to be too big in some jurisdictions. So Bitcoin was unilaterally selected as a regulatory what's the word, target. And in so much as that happened in some jurisdictions, that meant that Ethereum was being used for routing value, because, and I think this was mostly Asian jurisdictions where if you used Bitcoin, you had to comply with A, B, C, and D. So people did switch to Ethereum to route value in those jurisdictions because Ethereum didn't have the same name brand that Bitcoin did. So there's some play there. It's not as simple as them being a zero-sum game, but I think ultimately that might be the rubric ultimately. But it's not to say that you want to go on an all-out assault. Like there's rooms for things to degrees, I think. And so, like, for somebody like Andreas who comes and may say that he does like both systems, that's probably true. The real question is, to what degree does he like both systems, and to what degree do you like both systems? And that's kind of what the fight is about, like where to draw the lines.
I see. That makes a lot of sense. In the spirit of sort of disclosing our positions, I used to be just wholesale agnostic on like maximalism viewpoints of cryptocurrency. I've sort of adopted a soft maximalism perspective on Bitcoin, and some tweets that, or some conversations you were involved in on why you prefer Ethereum is, at least a couple ideas that I saw you suggest, is that, well, for one thing, although I have to be honest, I'm not entirely sure when you're being sarcastic on Twitter and when you're being serious, but that's part of your craft, I assume. The fact that Ethereum supports blacklisting, the fact that it's a little bit more, if this is the correct use of the word, centralized in a way, and you even made the statement that a lot of the things that you see in Ethereum that you find attractive, you could also see, we do see in the current fiat money global regime. Is it true that those things are what you indeed find attractive about Ethereum, a little bit more centralized, controlled blockchain?
So, like, a little guide to me sometimes too is like, I don't know why I'm this way and other people aren't, but like I do try to evaluate things in an amoral tone. I don't necessarily achieve that because I'm a human, but in a lot of times I just want to throw an idea out there, either because it was interesting or it was funny, and like the degree to which there's a moral intent is either irrelevant to me or at my discretion not presented. And like you'll see sometimes when I write things, I write it in a way so that I don't have to be ascribed in like some assumptive intent, meaning like you can read it and say like, okay, this was just a thing presented at face value, independent of judgment, hopefully. Now you'll see people jump on in, and that's kind of the goal in a lot of ways, is to see where the assumptions lie. But yeah, I think that what I'm seeing now is, if we live in a world of regulatory acceptance, then like the transparency of Bitcoin is a feature. The transparency of Ethereum in the smart contract world is a feature. And I see, so like another way of looking at some of this stuff is in terms of a frontier model, wherein there is a frontier for smart contracts. There is a frontier for registered value transfer. There's a frontier for fungible value transfer. So I think in Ethereum, what I like in like the proof of stake model is I think that it's like uniquely suited for management by governments, in the sense that it's proof of stake. There's no work. So, or at least in model where it's proof of stake. So changes are easy to make. They've already written a blacklist feature in with the DAO. Like, rather than wear that as a source of shame, it should just be worn as a source of pride. And you can just offer the blacklist, because I think that no matter what Ethereum does at this point, it's going to be hard to argue to regulators that it doesn't support blacklisting. So like you can either preempt the friction by embracing it and just saying like, yeah, it's a feature, that's what we do. Because like you don't have to wear these things as your identity. Like if you as an individual don't like that plan, then you can join another project. Like you can just hit a button and convert your Ethereum to something else. And I think Ethereum just has to own its shit, basically. That's what it did. That's what it does. That's what it will do. And sort of like this willful ignorance where you pretend that it doesn't do blacklisting isn't a world that is compatible with our history at this point. So I think I like Ethereum now for this function. I think that it'll do well with this. And if it doesn't do well, what I will say, it's at least worth it to people to promote that schism in the community, because it'll generate liquidity, it'll generate volume, and it'll make things hella fun for Bitcoiners to sit down and enjoy, which really we all should enjoy at some level, but some people don't. I don't know.
No, I agree to an extent, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find a Bitcoin maximalist that wouldn't agree with your statement that Ethereum should just own that characteristic, because that's one of their chief complaints about the Ethereum project as a whole. Um, that makes a lot of sense. Something else, though, sort of switching gears, although not entirely, that you like to talk about is, and you actually just released a podcast about it, the idea of tribalism and cults within the cryptocurrency space, and sort of like the undertones of this topic have shown themselves through what we were just discussing for the past few minutes. Break down the tribalism that you see for us, since we're not going to go listen to your full podcast in the middle of our conversation right now, even though our listeners should, and I'll include it in the show notes and that sort of thing. But break down the tribalism that you see today compared to 2010 or 11 when you first got here, the evolution of the tribalistic sentiment within Bitcoin and cryptocurrency.
Yeah, well, we've always had tribalism in life. Like the humans, tribalism is the default hierarchy and social attitudes and behaviors of humans when they're put together, and no technology is applied to management. So like when three dudes just play pickup basketball, we have some degree of resolution of issues. We have some degree of tolerance for risk. If three women go and do this, or if a group of men and women do this, like if there's no real like appeal to government and appeal to science and technology, people behave in a tribalist way. So if we start with perhaps that description of tribalism, then we can say, okay, well, what kind of things do people do when there's no management, and it's just sort of this innate free for all? And like, while there's a huge degree of variance, some things are more or less constant. We typically, as humans, align around a shared faith, and these shared faiths might, in the case of basketball, be basketball. Like if you show up and you're going to play basketball, I can probably tell you that the three guys involved are going to like their local sports team, or if they don't like their local sports team, they at least like the spirit of basketball. And for you to show up and say, like, I don't know what the local sports team is, that would be outside of accordance with their sort of center of belief. And you would, at that point, be accused of blasphemy. It may not be so vindictive and ugly that as somebody who doesn't know what the local sports team is, you would get killed. But online, we see this kind of do happen in a lot of ways. If the moral belief is unstoppable code, and that's the Ethereum pitch, and then all of a sudden we have something like the DAO, well, you saw what happened. Some people could not live with that reality, and they went left while others went right. And there are other things. Like the big components, I think, of tribalism is definitely the rallying around a holy belief or a set of holy beliefs. The notion that blasphemy needs to be chased out. The people who are blasphemous are witches, for lack of a better description. Historically, this was what we would probably have literally accused them of, is witchcraft. And you'll see then that once we have this notion of witches, we depersonalize these people. They're no longer humans. They exist as ideas that are representative of our oppressors or our outside forms. So you can think of that now. I think like in 2017, these are highly political, of course, although we'll laugh about this in 5 to 10 years. You have the witches that are the Trump supporters, or the witches that are misogynists, or the witches that are racists. And like, while these people, like in those terms, are not good people, the notion that the group would just label somebody without like asking them questions or get the court of public opinion, very tribal. And the civility that would normally make a society function is abandoned. Due process goes out the window. And what you end up oftentimes having is an inability to scale a community because of these restrictions, the sort of lack of appeal to reason, the lack of civility, so on and so forth. So I see that a lot in this space. And I put a video, What is Tribalism? You can search for it, What is Tribalism, by Chris DeRose. And I don't know that I did the best job on this, but we're working on it. I try to put together like a little 10-minute guide so that people can understand what tribalism is, so they can look out for it in their communities, and maybe point to this video under, the impression at least that maybe this isn't the best way to scale our group. And I'm seeing it a lot now. Another component of tribalism that's really important that you should just like snap to attention on this: motivated ignorance. When you have a moral belief that holds your group together, you will be inclined to ignore things that don't comport with that faith. Because if something enters, if you like believe that, I don't know, unstoppable code let's pick a real example in Ethereum. I guess there is still a contingent that probably believe that unstoppable code is what they want. So then if you come in here and you say, okay, proof of stake allows us to stop code, like just bringing up the question or just asking will get you chased out of the room, because people want to they want to keep the ignorance flowing. The ignorance is in fact the strength of the community. And while they may not individually understand that, they will see the sensitivities and the anxieties around these questions in others, and sensing that it raises anxieties, they'll chase you out for asking questions. And so that's very tribal as well. Like it's arguable whether that's an efficiency, because there's in many ways, we want that. Like a lot of families are entirely tribal and they have to be. And there's good things about that, such as we will remain a family if we just agree to these principles. We can maybe keep out a lot of difficult issues, and that works a lot. Like religions often play on that a little bit and make people's lives better as a result of that. So these are hard issues, but what's interesting here is that you have this completely exotic new technology and nobody has a category to put it in. So are we companies? Probably not. Are we communities? Probably. And then, if you kind of go from there, you can pull out what we can expect in the space, given lessons from the past in decentralization, quite frankly, which we've done before.
Sure, yeah. And at the risk of being too pedantic, some of the things you were describing, like the motivated ignorance and the constant need for purism within your beliefs, whether they're motivated by reason or just sort of abstract religious sentiment, borders very strongly on not tribalism categorically, but a sense of a cult. And so at the risk of asking you to make a normative or moral statement on tribalism, my impression is that you don't think tribalism is bad per se, but it carries the potentiality to yield undesirable effects when it sort of transitions to a cultish tribe rather than just a tribal community structure per se. And the cults within Bitcoin and cryptocurrency writ large show the motivated ignorance and witch hunting and all that sort of thing from people who dare to question beliefs that they hold as not just suppositional truth, but presuppositional truth, and don't even want to be questioned. Now, I have a lot of respect for people in the space who hold opinions very different from mine and are willing to engage in these discussions, but cults are very much the evolution, in my opinion, the evolution of the tribes that we see in Bitcoin. And I don't know, how do we fix the cult? Should we just embrace it as the way cryptocurrency is, or how do we eradicate the cults, or I guess protect ourselves from becoming involved in them in the first place in this community?
So it's an excellent question. Excellent question. I struggle a lot with it, and I can only bring you up to date on my current reasoning. But I don't know what the difference is between a cult and a sect, if not the insinuation that a cult is bad. And so if that's the case, it seems to me that we use the word cult when we want to present social distance from a group, when we say this group is a negative group. And that's a perfectly fair assessment for many groups in society. Certainly, as groups get more and more extreme, they end up incurring greater and greater sacrifices in their members in ways that can be very bad for membership. And history is, full of those examples of Jonestown and these types of things where the group got so far away from mainstream norms that they ended up, with terrible losses. I think that when we normalize the word cult, that it becomes problematic when these groups do actually do things that are that extreme. So I try to use the word with a little bit more caution, because I've seen this a number of times now. It used to be that being a sexist was a terrible thing. It used to be being a misogynist was a terrible thing, or racist was terrible. And now I'm so desensitized to it, because I've seen so many times when someone just flies off the handle and uses a term that was very charged for something that just wasn't a big friggin' deal. And then the victims there are the people who really would have ended up saved if the word was kept in higher esteem. So I think with cults, number one, we do kind of want, a cult-like following is kind of good for our investments. So if we consider movies that have cult-like followings, they do really well. And it doesn't have to be a bad assessment in that case, because we see it as a group of eccentrics that found something that they rallied around. that no other thing provided. And it was kind of weird because it picked these people out of society to, kind of represent it. That was kind of strange. But like as an investment, that's good. You want that in a product. Apple had a cult-like following in the earliest years for people who like design, maybe, or like the purity of the anti-establishment happy computer. So I think that for me, like I don't blame anybody for using the word cult. I totally get where it comes, but I think that creating social distance is a premature. Though I will say I've seen like in IOTA, there's been some very strange behaviors that left unchecked would have probably or certainly deserved that label. And we should see that in this space as it grows. We should see full on religions. And but here's the thing I'll say about that. Like in a lot of ways, these groups that normalize that are labeled cults over time end up normalizing at benefit of their users. So like Christianity could be said to be a cult, but like I see a lot of happy people there. And like while we can show a lot of tragedies that have happened, I think that on average, like that might be a good way of life for people. So it's conceivable that that'll happen here. Look, I just saw on DirecTV the other day that Scientology has a TV channel. Now, I had been very inclined to call Scientology a cult. I still would be very inclined to. But like, if Scientology keeps going for like 500 years, like it's just going to be like another normal thing that you are. And like, if you could invest in Scientology today, or if you could have invested in Scientology 20 years ago, or whatever, you might be a very rich man. So they're very murky. Like there's no easy answers on some of this stuff.
Two virtue signals that you've called out repeatedly and specifically is the blockchain as some sort of panacea and women in blockchain. And I want to get into why you hate women a little bit later. But you tweeted about the former virtue signal that the idea of the blockchain as a panacea is sort of losing some of its steam. And yet, just yesterday, you and like a dozen other people retweeted The Economist asking if blockchain could save Amazon rainforest, just like the latest instantiation of insane claims about the blockchain. Is it really losing steam? Like, where are we in the lifespan of the blockchain as something just like ethereal and mythical and magical?
Yeah, I think for me, when you retweet something or even like something, like what you're saying is this deserves attention. And I don't know, a lot of people want it to be an endorsement. But again, for me, like I'm just like, no, this just deserves attention. And so blockchaining the rainforest deserves attention in my mind, just from the irony factor. But like if people buy it, like I don't know that people take themselves really seriously, and I can be guilty of this. But like the reality is that like when we add a little jinx, like it's kind of like just a drop in the bucket. And I don't know that like people need to be carrying around like the baggage of like these identities that they just find interesting sometimes, or like these ideas that they just experiment with sometimes. So like what happens to words in society, like for people that like might find this boring, I totally get it, because like this is really high level stuff, like really high level stuff. But I think that there's a lot of predictive power here in ways that aren't obvious to people who don't clue into it. Because like we have in society these like, I was in the Charlottesville riot, and that was such an important experience in my life, and I don't regret it at all. And I highly recommend that everybody that is listening to this try their best to attend a riot at some point in your life. It's going to be scary. I would hope it doesn't end badly for you, but if everything goes unscathed, then you will see a slice of humanity that is a metaphor that carries over onto the internet, into larger spaces. And what I'm realizing about people is that in groups, we act very strange. Individually, I can get to know somebody, and there's so much reason and likability there 9 times out of 10. But then we go into groups, and what happens when we get into groups is we start to depersonalize. We take away a lot of the things that make us unique, and we try to conform to an average. We try to say, okay, this is what I think. It's like this Keynesian beauty contest thing where you're like, I think other people think this is the average, so I will act this way so as to cause the least amount of friction so that I can acclimate to this group in a way that ultimately enables me to empower myself or empower those around me. But then what ends up happening is, because you're a human being, and for a lot of reasons that are fairly complicated, your idea of what the average is differs from what the next guy thinks that the average is. So what seems to happen is people who would never do this in their personal life will act in a way that is foreign to perhaps like their authentic identity, and then take outrage over somebody else who's acting inauthentically, either under the perception that that person is being authentic, which is hilarious because everyone's pretending, and like they think that they are the only ones who's pretending. Yeah. And so I think that when we look at these like norms, like that's kind of what words are, is like some normalized idea. And there's a lot of nuance in any given word. There's a lot of connotation in any given word. And like you can say this word to somebody and it'll, while it'll mean something literally, the feelings that that person attaches to it, that baggage carries into the next sentence and into the next sentence. And then before you know it, either you're fighting or you're pitching him something, or he's buying something, or he's pitching you something. Like that's weirdly how communication works. So in the sense of blockchain, what seemed to have happened for reasons that I are really interesting, we can get into maybe. But what happened was blockchain just became excellence of any kind. And these things happen in society over the years. We have these words that end up just meaning excellence. And in a lot of ways, like this sort of Jungian sense, these are archetypal concepts in human heads. We believe that in an average group, saying this thing will be okay all the time. So like "Go America," or like let's empower the women," or any of these things will be perceived as zero or no risk things to say. And then before you know it, the prospectors come and attach different financial vessels to this word. So I think Aret is how you pronounce it. Aret is the Greek god of virtue, and it's kind of like naming this phenomenon, even going back to Greek times. And what we have now with blockchain is something that seems to be a pure project. Like if you were to do, I don't know, what's like something fun? I don't know, like a prediction market, that's fine. If you did a blockchain prediction market, independent of any technical assessment in the eye of the beholder, this is now a better thing. And so much so that you can like not have an incorporation. You can not have any shareholder rights. You can offer zero in the way of like past performance. You will just have a piece of paper that says all the good things that you believe. And those things will center around these terms, blockchain being one of them. Decentralization is yet another. And investors will look at this and feel confident that they can take the same set of virtues to the next guy. And then the cycle just kind of like repeats for a little while until everybody moves on for reasons that nobody understands.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that analysis. Hopefully blockchain is losing, the blockchain is some sort of like normative good, sort of like an adjective rather than a noun in and of itself, is losing steam. And I'm curious if you have any guesses as to what the next replacement for blockchain is, whether it'll be smart contracts or, I don't know, anything else that comes in the next decade or so that we see replaced as some sort of easily accessible virtue signal for people who are more or less technically illiterate or not sufficiently technically literate to understand what they are signaling per se, but just sufficiently involved to be able to use this word and sort of exploit the presumably positive baggage that it carries for whatever project they're trying to launch. Is there a replacement for blockchain you see on the horizon?
Well, we've in society is funny because like we have these maps that we draw of the territory, but nobody appreciates that the maps are a process of construction. So we look back at the maps of our land, for example, and we say like, okay, well, here's the border between Canada and the United States. But there was a time when that didn't exist, and there's a bunch of people that were sitting around either shooting each other with arrows or muskets, or negotiating to decide where those places would be. And we're kind of doing that right now online. Same exact process. We're figuring out where the borders are. And so like we've had a number of these buzzwords that come through, and these buzzwords seem as if they're like natural places for borders, seemingly, and then everyone kind of has tried to figure out where the hell this damn buzzword as an idea exists, where the power dynamics are. So we had things like Web 2.0, we had the dot-coms, we had we had a few other, like the semantic web, we had big data or something, we had IoT. And so like these buzzwords seem like they're going to be natural borders. They don't always turn out to be natural borders, but they're at least perceived as one. And so like blockchain clearly has taken up one of those roles right now. And I think in the case of blockchain, it really does express something very fundamental, which is still developing, that have very, what's the word? I think deep views on. But I think that the blockchain term is probably going to mutate to cryptocurrency. Whether or not cryptocurrency will achieve the same size as blockchain is still TBD, but I think that is in fact the underlying efficiency, or at least the underlying border that we'll probably settle on over time. And I even see that in Ethereum, where like whereas prior it used to be a smart contract platform. It's now starting to be understood by investors as a cryptocurrency. Maybe not amongst the in group, the old crowd, but amongst the new people and the out crowd. They just see it as being a cryptocurrency alongside anything else, and like the features are kind of incidental to it being a cryptocurrency. So I think that that's probably where blockchain will go as an iteration in the public psyche. And then in terms of like what the next pump is, like you never know. Like it's weirdly, I feel like you gotta. I guess what has to happen is you gotta find out where the shame is. Like that's usually where you're gonna hit pay dirt. Not always. So like if society has like a mental wall around something, if they say, and you got to be careful because like some mental walls are really, really damned good, and we better respect them, to be clear. But if you look at a mental wall and you see like a lot of people are telling you not to do this, but I can't figure out why. What's probably going on there is you have a lot of people who either don't have the time or cognition or interest in exploring that area and are just pessimistic about it. And then that pessimism seems to like bubble into a general fear, albeit one that's unfounded. So like I think the way to really look at it, so like let's take an easy one, like I don't know, don't touch minors. Okay, like everybody understands that's a great shameful border. And the easy answer for that one is that they're developing minds. They don't understand the world. You're inherently a predator. They're still under the custody of an owner that is their parents, and like the list kind of goes on and on from there. So that's a good border. But then you take something like Bitcoin was in the early years, where we looked at it and it was like a currency. And like a lot of people, like they couldn't tell you why a currency was bad. They would probably say like, okay, Liberty Reserve ended up with people getting arrested. And then you say, well, but this is different. But like that didn't matter. Like that at that point, the wall was up. But for somebody who kept going and looking in that space and like either trying to de-risk the concerns for others and finding themselves unable to, like for example, like the Liberty Reserve guys went to jail. Well, okay, but this doesn't have an obvious center. But like that would satisfy your curiosity, and that would satisfy your like issues with the technology. And then you try to communicate to others. If you see that they are not as easily assuaded, like that means they have a mental wall up. So like that's oftentimes a good place to find pay dirt. Like that is the frontier. That's the place that is not home. So as an explorer, you go there and you start looking for where the wealth is. It doesn't mean necessarily that you'll find it, but it does mean that is underappreciated and there's high risk, which means that commensurately there would be high reward for anything you found there. So if we knew what the next buzzword was, we'd all be flocking there already. My suspicion is that it'll probably be around like some moral boundary that was arbitrary and poorly conceived. Oftentimes, it should be said, the technology enables these things. So like something will come out and people will be weirded out by it. Like there was a time, I think, like the fruit was so low on YouTube, that low hanging on YouTube in like 2009 or 10. Like any of us could go back in time and be PewDiePie, knowing what we know now. But the reason why people didn't do it then was in part because they were scared of being an online public person, which is very hard. And certainly it was very hard for the time. But for anybody like an explorer that was willing to go out and take that risk, that was a frontier that was poorly settled, that had low-hanging fruit, and you could have capitalized on it. And so I think that analogy will carry us forward. I don't know that I have a concrete answer for you on what will be next. People are looking at VR, and I think that VR is very interesting, but I don't know that that's an easy low-hanging fruit for people. So I'm a little bit skeptical there. I still think there's lots of runway here in the blockchain space in a post-blockchain sense.
Speaking of sort of uncomfortable borders and morality, on the same thread of this virtue signal discussion, the second virtue signal is that of gender dynamics, gender equality within the Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, blockchain technology space. And you and Mike in Space and some others have sort of taken up the banner of engaging in a very entertaining but simultaneously intellectually rigorous way on Twitter. This idea that there is a dearth of female talent within the cryptocurrency space, which on the one hand I hold is patently not true. I mean, maybe in numbers on the breakdown of individuals that are working in this space, but as with regards to the innovation and projects being led by women, I would say it's at best balanced by some of these phenomenal women doing incredible things. My question to you to sort of start off this conversation about women is why do you hate women, Chris? What's your problem with them?
Right. Yeah, so like it's so interesting to me because like people don't know anything about me other than what they've heard generally. And it's always interesting. Like a person, like I don't know to what degree you've seen this yet, but what happens? A couple things happen. Like there's the phone game, number one. So like if somebody says that like I don't know, cut a girl off in traffic or something, like that turns something way worse than it actually is. Or if geez, you say something in a context of the times and then you play it later, like it was perfectly valid at the time. You can see this throughout history. Like so many things that are just a-okay in like 1995 are not in 2005. So that happens all the time. And like the incentive for people to find boogeymen is very high politically in society because like you have these anxieties in people, and these anxieties are often relieved by, and this is a little bit tribal too, expunging the witch. Like if you can burn the witch, the village will be blessed again. And so there's an incentive for a lot of politicians to find people, often, sadly, often the people who themselves are like vulnerable, usually, if not always, to sacrifice. So like for me, I had a fallout with my partner at BU in early 17, right as this thing was kind of kicking off. So a number of people saw me in a position, I think, socially, because I was getting my footing again. And they chose me for reasons that aren't even like that bad, honestly. I don't totally blame them. I get it. To sacrifice as the public rapist. And this has happened multiple times in my life. And the reasons for it, I would say, are fairly straightforward. And I have like an irreverence about women that I don't know is common in people. I have a sister that might actually probably have a lot to do with it, I guess. Wherein, like, I think people who don't have sisters see women a little differently than those who do, because, like, I just see my sister as another person who happens to be sitting down. That's really just it. Like, there's really nothing else about her that makes her different than any other person. And so, like, I try to treat people like that in public. But then, like, other people will be like, well, you got to be this way with women or that way. And I get it. Like no one's really wrong here. There's many different shades of right. But yeah, so I think that I got this reputation and I just took it because, frankly, I found a lot of the intolerance to be unacceptable. I found the liberalism to be unacceptable, and I didn't mind being a poster child that opposed that. And I feel like when we survive these takedowns, when we, like, here we are, we did the thing, we're like, I agreed even to bear the shame for the people who, in my estimation, had very reasonable attitudes towards women. I now have the empowerment to speak on behalf of the issue because, like, I did the time. Through the oppression, I achieved the virtue of authority on this matter. So, like, people will say, well, Chris, you're not authorized to speak for women. I go, okay, well, let's talk about it. And, like, fewer and fewer people are choosing to take me up on that challenge. For the very simple reason, I think, is that my views are very reasonable at this time. I think that, like, there was a hysteria in 2017. I don't want to blame people. I want to have mercy here. I want to blame the antagonists of the time. But at that time, because sensitivities were high, outrageous things were being claimed in the name of women. They were sacred cows at that time, and you can take these, like, unbelievable stances that I don't think would fly today. As a result, though, I fell one way, the mainstream fell another, and now we're kind of hitting a mean again, where we can have level-headed discussions on women. I think as a TLDR, my opinions on gender and sexuality I really have a lot about them, and it's hard because it's such a difficult issue for people, but I think that, like, at the macro level, you can say things like women have lower IQ, black people have lower IQ, men are more likely to commit crimes historically, or whatever these macro assessments are. But the trick is to take this sort of, like, macro micro view of the world, wherein you take an assessment of the swath of the population and you leave it at that. And then when a person comes your way at your door, you erase all of that baggage on the macro level and you give that person the benefit of a blank slate. That is, I think, the way to operate in society. And the reasoning for that is, like, very simple. That, number one, let's just say that women on average have lower IQ. Fine. What if we have a program that was turned on yesterday that is changing that? What if, like, that is a lagging indicator of the times? Okay, so women that were born before, like, 2015, fine, may have a lower than average IQ. Let's just say. I don't know if that's true. But for the woman that shows up in 2016 now, the only way they're going to get past that stereotype is if you give them individually a blank slate. And I don't know that that's being done enough. And I don't know that nuance is being captured. And there was a time, seemingly last year, when I think the liberalism was growing so great that anybody who dared ask a question or dared bring up an uncomfortable fact and try to like just talk about it was deemed a rapist for doing so. And I think the reason that that happened to me as well, I have to say too, is that like I am a deviant. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm even proud of that. I like deviation. I think that there's a time and place for it, and I understand that it's like there are ramifications to being a deviant. But like at some level, I was just born this way. I've actually dealt with radiations before my life because I think that too, at the macro level, women are risk normalization functions. Like they choose the reproductive strategy. And one of the ways that societies have probably done well is by preventing deviants from recreating, because on average, deviants do a really shitty job of producing good kids and producing like sensible policy. But here in like 2018, we have the ability to accommodate more deviants in society because we have technology that offsets their risk in many ways. And as a result of that, in many ways, deviants can provide more value, seeing that their risks are through technology a little bit better handled. So, but nonetheless, I think that our primitive sort of like behaviors are, particularly I think as a macro level of women, to pick on deviant men and cast them out, because like the fear is, of course, that they will pollute the tribe of other men. And before you know it, like, and it's a legitimate concern. Like if Chris DeRose finds an uncomfortable fact about women, like the thing is that he will convert all men into like men that think women are stupid. And like, I don't know what to say to that. It's a little bit crazy to me in 2018, but maybe, I don't know, you see it differently. I don't know.
That's a lot to unpack there. But on the macro level of that conversation we just had, one thing I don't appreciate which online is just sort of the Wild West for ideas and interpersonal interactions and that sort of thing. But I appreciate, on the whole, your, as you described earlier, moderately amoral, but thoroughly dispassionate, sprinkled with a little bit of sarcasm and snarkiness and that sort of thing, approach to these very complicated technological, interpersonal, sociological ideas that intersect in this space. I have a list of other things I would love to talk about, but before we sort of have to wrap this up now, can you just briefly run down your Twitter handle, your website, and things where our listeners can follow you and read more of your thoughts and ideas and keep track of things that you write and publish?
Sure. DeRose, DeRose, that's my Twitter handle. ChrisDeRose.com is my website where I put up all kinds of stuff that I've done. Everything from videos to articles I've written, et cetera, et cetera. And the YouTube channels that I have are DeRose Uncensored and Swipe Right for Governance. So I just started the latter. I would definitely ask you guys to check out the latter to see if it's useful, and maybe link to my What is Tribalism video with others to see if they find it useful. Share that around. The goal there is effectively to get everybody on like the same page of civility in the cryptocurrency space. So I really want to encourage and foster discussion around what that average should be. And I think that everybody can probably find a lot of use there over time as I start to de-risk topics that perhaps in their normal life they can show to others and say like, hey, I think maybe we're on this spectrum right now. Maybe that's not useful. Here's why. Hopefully it develops that way. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, those are most of my big properties at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you coming on the show and engaging in some conversations about some of the topics that we have today. Honestly, I can't thank you enough for doing that. It's been an absolute pleasure. I look forward to producing and releasing this episode that all of you are listening to now. Thanks so much, Chris. This has been a blast.
Yeah, thank you so much. We'll keep in touch. We'll do this again.
This CoinPod has been a production of You, Me, and BTC. Special thanks to my colleagues Tim Baker and Daniel Brown, and an extra special thank you to Chris for chatting with me today. Be sure to follow Chris on Twitter and view his discussion on tribalism and cults, linked to in the show notes for this episode. As always, follow @TheCoinPod on Twitter to stay up to date with each week's new episode, and message me on Twitter with any questions, comments, or critiques about what you're listening to. And if you've missed any previous episodes, visit thecoinpod.com to catch up. We'll be back next week with another CoinPod, so until then, cheers.